Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
It was one of those curious summer days in London when the city seemed at once to simmer with heat and yet wear the same dour greys of habit. July had come, but the air hung thick not with sun, but with soot and the distant rumble of approaching thunder. At Baker Street, the curtains had been drawn against the glare, and Holmes, having dispensed with both dressing-gown and pipe, paced restlessly between the settee and the fireplace, fingers steepled and eyes abstracted. I had scarcely taken 2 sips of my tea when a clatter on the stairs was followed by the urgent knock of Mrs. Hudson, who entered without waiting for a reply. Her face bore that curious blend of irritation and intrigue that only the most peculiar sort of visitor could provoke. "A gentleman, Mr. Holmes. Well, I'll let you judge for yourself." With that cryptic remark, she withdrew, and a moment later a man stepped into our sitting room. Thin, perhaps a few years younger than myself, with pale, restless eyes and a collar that had clearly not been attended by a valet in days. His shoes, though he stood on a fine Persian rug, were caked in a thin, crumbling layer of reddish dust, the sort one might associate with dry country roads in the heart of summer. His frock coat hung askew from his narrow shoulders, and a droplet of perspiration clung to his brow. Holmes turned at once from the fireplace and fixed the man with that hawk-like gaze which has reduced many a hardened criminal to trembling confession. "You have come directly from Northamptonshire," he said before the man had opened his mouth. The stranger blinked. Yes, that's true." "You took the 6:10 train from Kettering this morning, changed at Market Harborough, and arrived in London a little before noon. You hesitated outside our door for a full 10 minutes, perhaps more, before mustering the courage to knock." The man's jaw slackened. "Forgive me," Holmes said with a slight bow. "It is not magic, only observation. Your shoes, of course. July dust from rural clay roads is of a particular hue and texture. The right heel bears the mark of a stone platform edge typical of the Market Harborough station. The hesitation, well, Mrs. Hudson's exasperation was as telling as a watch chain." The man managed a thin, rattled smile. "My name is George Ellicott. I believe something terrible has happened, and I don't know who else to turn to." "You have chosen wisely, Mr. Ellicott," I said, gesturing for him to sit. "What is the nature of your trouble?" He sat slowly, as though the very act of unburdening had cost him dearly. "It's my uncle, Dr. Ambrose Northcote. He's gone missing. Vanished 3 days ago. At first, we thought he had simply gone off to one of his lectures. He's a historian, you see, obsessed with old churches and English manuscripts. He'll disappear for days if he finds a ruined abbey or a Saxon footnote worth his time." Holmes nodded. A man of focused enthusiasms. "And yet this absence troubles you." Ellicott leaned forward. "Because he would never leave behind the Curzon manuscript. Never. It's the rarest thing in his possession, a 9th-century palimpsest he found during a trip to a convent in Belgium. He kept it with him at all times. When he went missing, it was left in his study, open as if he had only just set it down. The lamps were still burning, and, this is difficult to say, but there was a smell in the room." "Smell?" Holmes asked sharply. Ellicott hesitated, "Like burnt almonds." "Very faint. My aunt dismissed it. Said the maid had likely spilled something in the grate. But Prussic acid," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. I straightened. "Surely you don't mean—" "I mean only that such a smell should not be present in the study of a living man," Holmes said. "Continue, Mr. Ellicott." "I returned to the house 2 days later. By then the police had been called. My aunt insisted. But they found nothing. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no body. Just the abandoned study and my uncle's shoes by the door." Holmes, who had been seated on the arm of the settee, stood abruptly. "Shoes?" "Yes. His walking shoes, his old ones, muddy from the morning he disappeared. And his boots, still in the cupboard. He never wore them unless he planned to go out in the countryside. He had mentioned a village by name, Ashton Leigh. He'd meant to visit a church there, but there's no record of him ever arriving. Holmes turned to me, eyes alight. "Watson, this has the makings of a most stimulating puzzle. We are to Northamptonshire this afternoon." "You will come?" Ellicott asked, half in disbelief. "I will come," Holmes said. "And if Dr. Northcote has not been murdered, abducted, or induced into some voluntary disappearance by forces as yet unseen, I shall eat your uncle's dusty shoes with mustard and salt." Ellicott gave a nervous laugh, but Holmes had already turned away, pacing now with fresh energy. "There is deception here, Watson. Dusty shoes in July, a palimpsest left open, and the ghost of bitter almonds. Mark my words, a mind has orchestrated this disappearance with precision, but every mind leaves a trail." We departed that same afternoon, with Ellicott in tow and Holmes humming some forgotten Gregorian chant beneath his breath as the train whisked us northward into a landscape thick with secrets, one of which, somewhere in Ashton Leigh or its shadow, was waiting to be uncovered. The compartment of the northbound train rattled steadily as the English countryside passed in blurred tapestries of green and ochre beyond the rain-marked windows. Though Holmes often remained silent during such journeys, buried in thought or the folds of some obscure monograph. This time he sat upright, his gaze fixed on the smudged glass as though watching not trees and fields, but patterns invisible to any eyes but his. George Ellicott, our unexpected companion, sat opposite, nervously folding and unfolding a handkerchief on his lap. I had attempted, with little success, to coax him into conversation regarding his uncle's temperament and habits. Holmes, who had not spoken since we left the station, suddenly turned his head and spoke in a clear, unhurried voice. "You have not told us, Mr. Ellicott, what your uncle was doing with the Curzon manuscript at the time of his disappearance." The young man blinked, caught off guard. I'm not entirely sure. He kept it in his study, as I said. He was preparing a paper, I think, for the Royal Society of Antiquaries. Something about marginalia, layers of overwritten text in old religious documents. He was very excited. Claimed he had discovered a previously unknown reference to King Offa of Mercia. "Offa," Holmes muttered. "Curious. An Anglo-Saxon king known for borders and boundaries. Tell me, was he expecting any visitors in the days leading to his vanishing?" "Only the postman, as far as I know. But I did find one thing odd. My aunt told me that the bell had rung late the evening before he disappeared. She assumed it was an accident or a child's prank, but the maid swore it was rung twice, a full minute apart. Uncle had answered it himself, she said, but when she asked the next morning, he brushed it off and said it had been no one." Holmes made a small noise in his throat, halfway between curiosity and irritation. "And no one thought to follow that up?" "The housekeeper asked the postman. He delivered nothing that evening. There's no other regular caller." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Twice. Once to announce, and once to confirm. It was not a prank. Someone came to Dr. Northcote with purpose, someone he either recognized or had been expecting." I glanced between them. "It sounds like the sort of meeting one does not discuss. A secret rendezvous. Perhaps a scholar's disagreement turned personal." "Possibly," Holmes said, his voice detached, "but unlikely. Academics are not known to duel by gaslight. No, Watson, there is something else here. The dust on Mr. Ellicott's shoes." "My shoes?" Ellicott looked down in surprise. "You have tracked the very same red chalk into our compartment that your uncle left on his walking shoes. It is not the dust of a railway platform or a London street, and yet neither of you has been in the countryside this morning. Where, then, does it come from?" Ellicott flushed. I hadn't thought. I passed through the garden path at the side of the house. There's an old root cellar that's seldom used. Uncle Ambrose kept his fossil samples in it. It's never locked. I suppose I wandered through that way when the front door was being cleaned. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Indeed, I shall wish to examine that path. The cellar as well. Ellicott's fingers tightened on his handkerchief. You think something happened there? I think, Holmes said, that your uncle may have left through that garden path rather than by any main entrance, and if he did not do so voluntarily, then someone guided him or dragged him that way. We arrived at Kettering by mid-afternoon. From there, we took a hired trap through the gently rolling hills of Northamptonshire, past summer fields and churches, ancient as any abbey in France. Ashton Leigh revealed itself at the end of a winding lane, little more than a clustering of stone houses wrapped round a sunken green, its church spire poking like a weathered tooth above a copse of elm. Dr. Northcote's house sat a few furlongs beyond the village proper, bracketed by trees and half swallowed by ivy. As we dismounted, Holmes strode ahead of us up the gravel path with purposeful steps, pausing not at the door, but veering sharply to the left. Watson, with me. Mr. Ellicott, fetch the key to the root cellar. We followed Holmes around to the side of the house, where a narrow trail cut through overgrown yew bushes toward a half-sunken door of iron-strapped wood. The ground here bore a dry coating of red dust and flattened tufts of clover. Holmes bent low, eyes scanning, fingers brushing the surface with gentle taps. This soil is not typical of the rest of the garden, he murmured. Note the cracked patterning here. Fragments of something crushed underfoot. Bones. No. Seeds. A spill from a linen bag, perhaps. And here, look, Watson. I crouched beside him and saw the faintest impression in the clay. A scuff, the edge of a heel, and what appeared to be the ball of a toe angled sharply inward. A man walking, I said. Or running. No, Holmes replied. Stumbling. Look again. His gait is uneven. These marks are deeper on the left side. That suggests either injury or assistance. Ellicott returned with the key, and Holmes took it without a word, unlocking the door and swinging it open with a groan of rusted hinges. A breath of damp air met us, earthy, tinged with mold. We descended a short flight of stone steps into a narrow, vaulted chamber where shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes and glass jars, clouded with dust. Holmes moved silently, examining corners with his lantern until he came to a stack of crates pushed awkwardly aside. There, behind them, lay a single glove. Fine leather, the sort a gentleman might wear to shield his hands from dust while handling rare materials. Holmes picked it up delicately and turned it inside out. In the seam, nearly invisible, was a thin line of crimson. Blood, he said. Ellicott recoiled. But that glove is his. I'm sure of it. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then he stood, eyes gleaming with that peculiar, cold light which signaled to me that his mind was beginning to lock into alignment. We must speak with your aunt, he said at last. I wish to see the study exactly as it was left. Of course, Ellicott whispered. This way. Back in the house, we passed through a narrow hallway and into the late Dr. Northcote's study. The room was as he had described, a well-used armchair before a cold grate, 2 wall lamps with dried wicks, a mahogany desk upon which the Curzon manuscript lay open, its delicate vellum barely disturbed by the breeze sneaking through the half-closed window. Holmes made no move to touch the manuscript. Instead, he went to the grate and leaned down, sniffing. Then abruptly, he stood. No scent now, he said, but the brass poker bears a thumbprint in soot. Not from your aunt's hand, I presume. Ellicott shook his head. She wouldn't have touched anything. Holmes walked slowly to the desk, studying not the manuscript, but a corner of the blotter beside it. There, almost hidden beneath an inkstand, was a torn scrap of paper. Holmes pried it out with tweezers and held it to the light. The fragment was no larger than a postage stamp, but it bore a single word, hastily scrawled, "Petrol." Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes tucked the scrap into his case and stepped away from the desk. "There is an urgency here, Watson," he said quietly. "The kind I dislike. I suspect we are already a day too late. But it is not yet hopeless. Come, we have one more stop before nightfall." "To where?" Holmes's eyes were distant. "To the churchyard of Ashton Leigh, and then, if my suspicions bear out, to find a man whose shoes are too clean for July." The sun was low in the sky by the time we crossed the churchyard boundary, its feeble July light filtered through the heavy limbs of ancient yews and crumbling gravestones, leaning as though in mid-conversation. A mild wind stirred the dry grass, whispering through moss-covered names and dates, long surrendered to time. Holmes moved with his usual economy of motion, but I could sense the weight in each step. An almost imperceptible tension humming beneath his coat and collar, as if his mind was pressing far ahead of his body. Ellicott followed at a cautious distance, subdued yet alert. I kept beside Holmes, watching as he scanned not the graves, but the earth between them, the footpaths, the loose stones, the subtle bends in grass that might mean far more to his eye than they ever could to mine. "There," Holmes murmured after a time, halting abruptly near the north wall. "Note the crushed wild sorrel. It's only found in this portion of the yard. Grows poorly in shadow and seldom recovers from trampling. Someone was here recently. More than once." I followed his gaze. To my eye, the patch looked no different from any other unkempt border of earth, but upon closer inspection, I could make out a slight indentation leading toward the back of the church where the stonework met an older structure, an apse or small chapel long unused. Holmes crouched and ran a gloved hand across the flattened greenery. 3 days, possibly 4. And see this. Fine particles of red clay embedded in the stems. The same substance found near the root cellar. The man who trod here walked the same path, but the direction is reversed. He came from the churchyard to the house. Ellicott, still hovering behind us, stepped closer. That would mean he entered through the garden. At night. Likely, and without disturbing anyone in the house. Whoever came through here was either deeply familiar with the grounds or had scouted them beforehand. I glanced toward the old apse. Its small door stood half ajar, warped with age and stained with lichen. "Do you think he came from inside?" "I do," Holmes said. "And more than that, I think he hid something there before the disappearance." He stood and crossed swiftly to the door, pushing it open with care. The hinges protested softly, and we stepped into a cramped chamber thick with dust and silence. The room smelled of dry stone and parchment, a scent not unlike Dr. Northcote's study. The air was stale, unused, and yet something within it hinted at recent occupation. There were no furnishings, only a raised stone slab at the center and a wooden chest in one corner, half buried beneath a canvas sheet. Holmes approached the chest at once and knelt beside it. "Watson," he said without turning, "your assistance, please." Together we lifted the lid. Inside lay a jumbled collection of items: a lantern, a bundle of rope, several iron nails, a small trowel, and, at the bottom, a velvet pouch cinched tight. Holmes extracted the pouch and opened it. Within lay a ring, gold, heavy and oddly warm to the touch. It bore a sigil I did not recognize, an angular design that seemed at once ecclesiastical and alien. Holmes studied it for only a moment before slipping it into his pocket. "It confirms it," he said quietly. There was preparation involved. The man who came to Dr. Northcote's study did not do so on impulse. He had tools, secrecy, and a plan. But what troubles me most is that ring. Why? Because I have seen its like before. Once, in Vienna, worn by a man who called himself a priest but trafficked in forgeries. Church relics, falsified charters, bones marked as saints. A ring such as this would be his seal, his calling card. Petralchus, I stared at him. The name on the paper scrap? Yes, Holmes said, and I fear he's far more dangerous than any charlatan. He is clever, persistent, and without a shred of conscience. Ellicott stepped forward. You mean to say my uncle knew this man? I believe he did. Or rather, I believe Petralchus knew him. A scholar of antiquities, especially rare manuscripts, would be of great interest to such a man. But if Dr. Northcote discovered that he had been used to validate a forgery or enable a theft, he would never stay silent. We left the apse and retraced our steps through the churchyard. As we passed the rector's house, Holmes paused suddenly and tilted his head. Do you hear that? I stopped. Only the wind. No, beyond it. A ticking. Faint. We followed the sound to the rear window of the church. Holmes peered inside, then motioned sharply. The vestry was dim, but not deserted. A man sat hunched over a ledger near the far table, his fingers twitching nervously against the wood. The ticking was coming from a pocket watch he had laid beside his papers. A tall man, perhaps in his late 50s, with a pointed beard and sallow skin. He had not noticed us. Holmes rapped smartly on the glass. The man startled, then quickly rose and came around to the door. When he opened it, his eyes passed over Ellicott and me before settling uneasily on Holmes. May I help you? He asked in a soft, reedy voice. Holmes gave a slight bow. Forgive the intrusion. I am Mr. Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are investigating the disappearance of Dr. Ambrose Northcote. And you, sir, are... The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Holmes to catch it. Mr. Lemuel Hartley, he said. I am the church steward. I assist with parish records. Holmes nodded. Of course. Then perhaps you can tell us. Has anyone used the apse recently? Or been seen entering through the rear gate after dark? Hartley paled slightly. Number, that part of the church has been disused for decades. I would have noticed any activity. Holmes tilted his head. Indeed, even though you do not reside on the grounds. The steward fumbled. I live just across the green. I come in early most mornings. Holmes smiled without warmth. Mr. Hartley, do you recognize this? He held out the ring, now carefully wrapped in a handkerchief. The steward recoiled at once, eyes wide, hands clenched. No, he said too quickly. I've never seen it before. Yet it bears the mark of a false order, Holmes said quietly, and is tied to a man who may well have entered your church uninvited and left behind more than secrets. If you have aided this man, knowingly or not, it is time to speak. Hartley looked as if he might flee, but then his shoulders sagged. I didn't know his name, he whispered, only that he came asking about old burial lists, wanted to verify something about a knight named Moulton, buried under the apse. He offered money, said he was writing a history of obscure monastic rites. Did he bring anything with him? A case, narrow, locked. He told me it contained relics. I let him stay in the apse for 3 nights. I never asked questions. Holmes turned. Watson, that case may still be there. If it is, I dare say it does not contain relics, but something altogether more troubling. Mr. Hartley, you must tell us everything you can about this man's appearance, speech, and movements. Hartley nodded slowly. He said he would return this week, on the 4th day after he left. That's tomorrow. Holmes's face hardened. Then we must prepare to receive him, he said, but not as guests. This man believes he walks in shadows. Let us see how he fares in the light. The sun had long since set behind the spire of Ashton Leys Church, casting long, uncertain shadows that crept over the stones like whispered secrets. The warm July air had turned cool with the fall of night, and a pale half-moon cast a silvery haze upon the churchyard. Holmes and I stood just inside the apse's stone arch, hidden behind the warped door. George Ellicott had been sent back to the house under strict instructions to remain alert but unobtrusive. Mr. Hartley, subdued by Holmes's firm but tactful manner, had agreed to stay in the rectory and feign ignorance if approached again by the mysterious visitor. Holmes had impressed upon him the importance of precision and silence. We had concealed ourselves amid the broken pews and disused altars of the apse, a lantern dimmed and hooded between us. Holmes crouched in stillness, his lean figure like that of a resting hawk, poised to strike. I had become familiar over the years with the electric tension that gripped him in such moments when observation became its own form of pursuit, and the mind, like a spring wound tight, waited for the final turn of the key. The hours passed slowly. Distant owls called from the trees, and once or twice the wind stirred the grass with a hiss that sent a shiver down my spine. Holmes did not move. His eyes, faintly visible in the lamplight, never wavered from the slim opening that looked out onto the side path leading toward the garden. Then, just past midnight, a sound reached us, quiet yet distinct. A footfall. Holmes raised one hand in a small motion. I held my breath. Another step followed, then two more. A figure emerged from the trees beyond the wall, cloaked, hat pulled low. He paused, surveying the churchyard with the wary air of someone well versed in caution. The moon caught the edge of his cheek as he moved forward, a narrow face, pinched at the temples with a dark, neatly trimmed beard. He carried a satchel over one shoulder and something longer beneath his coat, too rigid for a walking stick. Holmes exhaled silently beside me. His fingers twitched once, then stilled. The man crossed the churchyard swiftly, treading the same crushed patch of sorrel Holmes had examined earlier that afternoon. He reached the apse door and hesitated only a moment before opening it. He stepped inside. I felt Holmes shift, rising with soundless grace. Before the intruder could properly register the shadow before him, Holmes had struck a match and lit the lantern, illuminating the chamber in a pale golden glow. The stranger stopped mid-step. His eyes, sharp, intelligent, but unmistakably alarmed, locked with Holmes. He did not speak, but I saw one hand slowly drifting to the inside of his coat. "That would be unwise," Holmes said coolly. "Unless what you carry is an ecclesiastical commentary." The hand froze. Holmes stepped forward. "You are known as Petralchus, a name drawn from a misreading of a 13th century chronicle, a fitting alias for a man who counterfeits history." The stranger's brow flickered. He recovered quickly. "You're very informed. I make it my business to be so. I assume you're not with the local police? I find their methods insufficient." "Then you're him," the man said. "Sherlock Holmes?" "Correct." The man glanced about the room. "You're too late. There's nothing left here." Holmes's voice remained calm, but I could hear the edge beneath it. "Then you won't object to a search?" Petralchus's eyes narrowed. "You have no right. I have the truth. And soon, the law will follow." Holmes gestured to me, and I moved to the corner chest. The same satchel Petralchus carried earlier was already on the floor, half open. I pulled it closer, revealing a slim wooden case tucked inside, precisely the dimensions of a manuscript. Petralchus lunged. Holmes moved faster. In a flash, he caught the man by the collar and shoulder, twisted, and brought him down with astonishing ease. The man hit the flagstone floor with a grunt. Holmes remained crouched over him, one knee pressed to his chest. "I advise you to remain still," he said. The struggle ceased. Petralchus lay winded, glaring upward. I opened the case. Inside, wrapped in linen and secured with ribbon, was a manuscript. But not the Curzon. This was something different. The binding was leather, aged, with a broken clasp and a single emblem embossed on the corner, an archaic cross partially effaced. Holmes leaned over and peered in. "The Chronicle of St. Breon," he murmured. "Long thought lost in a fire at Ashwood Priory. Yet here it is." Petralchus's voice was bitter. "Recovered, not stolen. I rescued it from a collector who used it as a display piece. I gave it context, meaning. You gave it false provenance, Holmes said coldly. And had Dr. Northcote discovered that you had doctored the marginalia of this document to pass it off as authentic, you would have lost your most lucrative sale yet. He wasn't supposed to look that closely, but he did. Holmes stood, dusting off his coat. Now, you'll tell me what happened to him. Petralchus sat up slowly, wincing. He confronted me, said he'd go public, called me a parasite, said he'd expose every dealer I'd worked with. So I warned him to stay silent, that's all. I swear, warned him with what? A vial of prussic acid? Or was that simply your idea of a deterrent? The man's face paled. I didn't use it. I just wanted to frighten him, to buy time. Where is he? Holmes asked, voice low. There was a pause. Then, quietly, I left him in the cellar. Tied. I was going to come back, move him. But the house stirred too early. I fled. I felt a tightness in my chest. Holmes turned on his heel without another word and strode from the apse. I followed, and Petralchus, gritting his teeth, staggered to his feet behind us. We moved quickly across the yard, through the garden path, and down to the root cellar. Inside, Holmes seized the lantern from its hook and rushed to the corner where the crates had once been pushed aside. He pulled them away. There, beneath a heap of sacking, was Dr. Ambrose Northcote, pale, unconscious, but alive. "Watson!" Holmes barked. I was already beside him. I felt for a pulse, faint but steady. His wrists were bruised, his lips dry. There was a residue on the cloth tied near his face, a mild narcotic perhaps. Chloroform or laudanum. A dose meant to keep him quiet rather than kill. "We must bring him up," I said. Holmes nodded. "Mr. Ellicott must be fetched at once, and the police." He turned to Petralchus, who had remained silent throughout, watching with unreadable eyes. "You'll be charged," Holmes said, "and more than for theft, kidnapping, attempted murder, fraud, but it is not for me to determine your fate." Petralchus didn't answer. He stared down at the stone floor. Holmes turned back to me. "He'll recover, Watson." But this was no amateur's plot. This was a carefully constructed deception, and had the manuscript been sold and the body quietly disposed of, well, we would be reading about it in a footnote, not solving it under torchlight. I nodded. It was the shoes, wasn't it? The dusty ones. "Yes," Holmes said, eyes glinting. "No one walks through that garden without leaving a trail, and I make it a rule, my dear Watson, always follow the dust." The following morning broke with a clarity rare for an English July, sunlight catching in the dewed hedgerows and casting long golden streaks across the gravel drive of the Northcote residence. Within the house, however, there lingered the breathless hush of recovery, a household roused from the brink of tragedy, yet not fully free from its shadow. Dr. Ambrose Northcote had been moved to his upstairs room, where he lay in bed propped by pillows, his breath shallow but strengthening. A physician from Kettering, summoned promptly by Holmes's telegram in the early hours, had confirmed that, save for dehydration and mild sedation, the scholar would recover in full. It was only a matter of time. Holmes and I had taken breakfast in silence. He stirred his tea with absent precision, his gaze drifting between the window and a small object he had drawn from his coat pocket. The peculiar ring, the seal of Petralchus, which he now examined beneath a pocket lens as if it might yet betray some further secret. The police had taken Petralchus into custody at dawn. Lestrade had not yet arrived, but we expected him by afternoon. Holmes had sent him a telegram so delicately worded it could have been mistaken for a dinner invitation, yet whose implications were unmistakable. Forgery, attempted murder, and a European smuggling ring. Arrive with care. "You're thinking again," I said, setting down my fork. "I rarely cease," he replied, though not unkindly. "But yes, Watson, there remains something unfinished, a question whose answer I have yet to isolate. About the manuscript? Number, about the man. He rose and paced once across the length of the room, tapping the edge of the ring against his finger. Petralchus, or whatever his name truly is, did not act entirely alone. That much is evident. A network of forgers, certainly. He admitted as much indirectly. But what troubles me is the timeline. You mean the day of the disappearance? Precisely. Dr. Northcote was seized and hidden on Tuesday. Petralchus, we now know, left the apse before dawn Wednesday. He planned to return today, Friday. That leaves a full 48 hours in which he neither contacted a buyer nor arranged transport for the manuscript. I frowned. Perhaps he lost nerve. Perhaps, Holmes mused. Or perhaps he was waiting for someone, or something. A light knock interrupted our thoughts. It was George Ellicott, looking as though he had not truly slept despite his efforts. "He's awake," he said softly. "He's asked for you both." We followed him upstairs. Dr. Northcote lay against the pillows, his skin pale, but his eyes, those eyes of a scholar used to poring over fine ink and ancient tongues, were sharp and restless. He offered a wan smile as Holmes approached the bedside. "I never thought I'd owe my life to red chalk and an overgrown root cellar," he murmured. "You owe it," Holmes said quietly, "to your nephew's persistence, and to your own unwillingness to part with the Curzon manuscript." Dr. Northcote chuckled, then winced slightly. He offered money first, then a partnership. When I refused, the tone shifted. He quoted me a Latin verse as if it were a bond. "Falsum est quod consentit silentio." What is false becomes truth by silence. I told him silence could be refused. "You mentioned the night Malton in your notes," Holmes said. "Why?" "Ah," Northcote said, and his face lit with weary pride. "Because I had begun to suspect. Petralchus claimed the Chronicle of St. Breon had been misattributed. He insisted that marginal notes proved it had been copied at the Abbey of Ashwood. But I found something he had not expected, a reference in the Curzon manuscript to Sir Edward Malton, a minor knight interred at Ashton Leigh." Holmes's brows drew together. "That name," Northcote continued, "was added after the manuscript's original composition, likely by the same hand that altered the Chronicle. It was a forgery, Watson, a clever one, but not clever enough. Malton never bore the crest shown in the manuscript. The seal was from a century later." "He'd planned to use your endorsement to sell the Chronicle," Holmes said. "Yes, and I refused him. The next day I was making ready to travel, to report the forgery to the Society. That was when he came." Holmes's face darkened. "He said you had called him a parasite." "I said worse," Northcote replied. "But it wasn't anger that frightened me. It was calm. He had prepared everything. The cellar, the drug, the lie. He said I'd be gone long enough for the truth to shift." There was silence in the room for a moment. Then Holmes turned. "I must go back to the church," he said. "There is one detail left untied, and I don't like loose ends." The grounds of the church were empty when we arrived. The apse remained sealed under constable watch. Holmes did not approach it. Instead, he moved along the outer wall of the vestry and followed the crushed grass line back toward the rear of the grounds. "Something heartily said," he murmured. He claimed the visitor asked about Sir Edward Malton's burial, but the ledger— "Watson, do you recall the placement of the watch?" "Ticking, beside the record book." "Exactly. Why place it so? To draw attention." "Number, to cover something." We reached the vestry door. It was open, left so by the local inspector. Inside, dust hung in the slanted light, disturbed only by the faint flutter of a curtain. Holmes moved straight to the table and lifted the ledger. Beneath it, pressed flat against the wood, was a scrap of folded parchment. He opened it carefully. It was brittle with age, but the ink, though faded, was legible. Holmes read it aloud. "Sir Edward Malton, buried beneath the apse. No marker. Beneath the false stone with the iron ring. Entry sealed by request of Bishop Averhill, 1754. He looked up at me. That's what Petralchus was after. Not just the chronicle, I said, breath catching. No, Holmes said. He came to plant the forgery, but he stayed to retrieve something. Something that may have been hidden here since the Reformation. I stared at him. You think Malton was guarding it? Holmes's smile was grim. I think Petralchus already knew what the chronicle claimed, that the original copy of the Book of Averhill, a lost volume of ecclesiastical canon law, was hidden beneath Ashton Leigh. The fake manuscript merely lent weight to the claim, but Malton's grave was the key. But he didn't find it. Holmes tapped the ledger. Because Hartley led him to the wrong stone, whether by accident or design, we may never know. We returned to the apse once more, accompanied now by the constable and the village rector. Beneath the rear altar, partly concealed by rotted floorboards and mildew, was a small iron ring embedded in the stone. With effort, the slab was shifted. Below it lay a cavity no more than a foot deep, lined in old brickwork and earth. Within it, preserved in an oilcloth, were 3 tightly bound books. Their covers bore no titles, only the sigils of long-forgotten bishops and monasteries. Holmes crouched over them, not touching. There's your motive, he said softly. Forgery cloaked a deeper theft, and the dust on those July shoes was the first whisper of it all. He rose, brushing off his knees, and glanced at me. I think our work here is nearly done, Watson. But what will become of the texts? They will go to the proper hands, Holmes replied. Northcote will see to it, and if justice is to be served, Petralchus will face more than one courtroom. A fraudster, a deceiver of history, and almost a murderer. He paused. But in the end, just another man who misjudged the weight of silence. We left Ashton Leigh that evening, the village slowly exhaling the tension it had unknowingly held. Holmes spoke little during the train ride, and I did not press him. The summer evening gave way to a cool twilight, and London called us home once more. Fog, soot, and all. But as we crossed the last stretch of countryside before the city, Holmes looked out the window and spoke almost absently. Truth, Watson, he said, like buried scripture, will outlast the dirt they throw over it. It was nearly midnight when we stepped once more into the familiar confines of 221B Baker Street. London was steeped in one of its sulky summer fogs, the kind that crept up from the Thames and slunk along the window panes like a thief. The lamps glowed faintly, as if begrudging their duty, and the clop of a late cab on Baker Street's slick cobbles was the only sound that reached us from outside. Holmes, still in his travelling coat, walked directly to the fireplace, lit a match, and set flame to the kindling with mechanical precision. I, meanwhile, sank into the armchair opposite and let the comfort of the room settle over me like a warm coat. For a while, Holmes said nothing. He stood with one elbow propped on the mantel and his chin resting on a closed fist, staring into the newborn flames. But I had known him long enough to recognize the particular brand of silence that wrapped around him now. Not the contemplative quiet of closure, but a taut, restless tension that suggested the final piece had not yet found its place. "You're still troubled," I said gently. He stirred, but his voice was distant. "There's something in this business that continues to evade me, Watson. Something that does not sit properly." The manuscripts were recovered. Dr. Northcote is safe. Petralchus is in custody. Surely that is all. Holmes turned then, his eyes gleaming with the sharpness of a man not yet convinced of resolution. "You recall the false seal affixed to the Chronicle of St. Breon?" "Vividly. A crude forgery by your standards." "Indeed, and yet remarkably consistent in style. Too consistent." I blinked. I'm not sure I follow. Holmes moved to his desk, opened the top drawer, and drew out a slim notebook. He flipped through its pages until he came to a sketch I recognized at once. The cross-like, sigil impressed upon the corner of the forged manuscript. This symbol, he said, was not invented by Petralchus. It appears, with minor variations, in no fewer than 5 other cases of ecclesiastical fraud stretching back 10 years. I saw it once in Vienna, again in Florence, and most recently in a private collection in Bruges, each time presented as the mark of authentication on supposed relics of early British origin. And each time, the artifact was exposed as a forgery. I straightened in my seat. So he's part of a larger operation. Holmes nodded grimly. Yes, and worse, he's not the head. He shut the notebook and moved to the cabinet where his correspondence was stored. From it, he withdrew a letter, creased, wax-sealed, and bearing no return address. This arrived the morning we left for Ashton-Leigh, he said, handing it to me. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was precise, thin, and utterly unfamiliar. The content, however, sent a chill along my spine. Mr. Holmes, by the time this letter reaches you, the matter of Ashton-Leigh will be upon you. Do not be fooled into believing the manuscripts are your prize. They are not. They were meant to distract, meant to draw your attention to the surface, while more valuable ink bled beneath it. What lies beneath the false seal is a map, Mr. Holmes, a map you do not yet understand. But they do, and they are already moving. A friend of the truth. I looked up slowly. You didn't mention this. I had no proof of its connection to the case until we found the crypt beneath the apse. That message refers not merely to Ashton-Leigh, but to a pattern, a sequence of falsifications spanning years, and now I believe someone has deliberately lured me into playing their game. But why? Because, my dear Watson, they want to see if I can keep up. He resumed his seat by the fire and folded his hands. The lamplight caught the sharp line of his cheekbones and the glint in his eye. A glint I had seen only a handful of times before, always when the game revealed itself to be much deeper than any had guessed. Petralchus was clever, yes, Holmes continued. But he was an instrument. He did not forge those manuscripts himself, only planted them, laundered them, or passed them into the hands of collectors who were willing to ask few questions. He had funding, instructions, and protection. That ring we found. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a token of rank. I furrowed my brow. But then who? That is precisely the question. He stood again, restless now. Who operates such a network? One dedicated not simply to the sale of counterfeit relics, but to the rewriting of religious and historical records. What purpose does it serve? To place a forged manuscript beneath a forgotten altar, or to adjust a genealogy in the margins of an old psalter? A buyer's whim, I ventured. Perhaps, he admitted. But I think it is more than commerce. There is intent behind it, philosophical or political, I cannot yet say, but someone is shaping the past to their own ends. And that, he added, is far more dangerous than any simple fraud. I was silent for a long moment. Finally, I said, "What of Hartley? You think he was involved?" "I think he knew more than he said," Holmes replied, "but not enough to grasp the whole. His mistake was letting a stranger use the apse, and he will bear the consequences of that lapse. But his fear was genuine. No man reacts so viscerally to a symbol he does not recognize." Holmes moved back to the desk and opened the ledger he had brought from Ashton-Leigh, borrowed, with the rector's permission, to make sense of the burial notes. He pointed to the final page. Here, a marginal annotation made by a rector in 1831, referring to repairs made following the loss of the Averhill copy. Note the phrasing, not theft, not damage, but loss, as if the volume had disappeared in plain sight. "And it did," I murmured. "Hidden beneath Sir Edward Moulton." "Exactly," Holmes said. "And now, years later, it is unearthed. Only not by an honest historian, but by a thief acting under orders." He snapped the ledger shut. "The map mentioned in the letter," he said quietly. Maybe metaphorical. Or it may be literal. Markings in the Chronicle or the Averhill copy that point to other caches, other forgeries seeded into places of historical silence. Either way, the game is larger than I anticipated, and it is not yet over. He turned to me with sudden intensity. Watson, I will need you with me in the coming weeks. There will be more of this. More signs, more shadows. I suspect Ashton Leigh was only a test. You think whoever sent this letter intends to make contact again? No, Holmes said. I think they already have. He moved to the window, gazing out over Baker Street's darkened length. Somewhere in this city, he said, is the next step, and if I do not find it first, they will rewrite not just what we know, but what we believe. The fire crackled gently behind us. Outside, a bell tolled the hour, soft, distant, lonely. Holmes remained at the window, his silhouette sharp against the pane, as if already searching the fog for the next clue in a puzzle that had not yet named itself. And I, watching him from the armchair with a rising chill despite the warmth, knew that the case of the man with dusty shoes had merely dusted the surface of something far more perilous, and far from over. 3 days passed with a deceptive stillness. The usual fog coiled along the gutters of Baker Street. Hansoms rattled in the distance, and Mrs. Hudson fussed over meals we scarcely touched. But behind the quiet of our rooms, there was a growing tension, like the pause before the next move in a grand and dangerous game. Holmes had spoken little, but he had not been idle. He spent long hours at his desk, poring over ecclesiastical directories, private collectors' registers, auction house reports, and obscure volumes whose titles I could barely pronounce. Names were scribbled and struck out in his notebook. Diagrams of seals and marginalia bloomed and vanished like ghostly blueprints on his blotter. On the 4th morning, just as I was returning from an errand to Cavendish Square, I found Holmes standing over a freshly opened telegram. He did not look up when I entered, but handed it to me silently. To Sherlock Holmes, from Professor Vernon Laurie, Trinity College, Cambridge, arrived in possession of uncatalogued document via private agent. Sealed with variation of Petralchus emblem. Claimed origin, Caister Priory. Need urgent opinion. Can you come? Vial. I glanced up. Another forgery? Holmes's lips thinned. Or the next movement in this symphony of shadows. He reached for his coat. Pack for 2 nights, Watson. We leave by the noon train. Cambridge awaits. By early afternoon we were rattling through the countryside again, the green fields now familiar, but no less charged with quiet implication. Holmes sat opposite me in the carriage, uncharacteristically still, but I could tell from the precise flexing of his fingers that his mind was once again racing ahead of the train's progress. I've met Laurie before, he said at last. He's not prone to hyperbole. If he says the seal resembles Petralchus's, it does. But Laurie is also a man of the old order. Brilliant, yes, but with a particular weakness. He wants to believe. In the authenticity of the piece? Precisely. Show an academic something long considered lost, a charter, a transcript, a codex, and you'll see wonder trump caution. That's what these people prey on. They don't merely fabricate relics. They fabricate desire. They make experts complicit by tempting them to wish. We arrived in Cambridge under a pale afternoon sky and made our way directly to Trinity College, where Professor Laurie, a short, stooped man with a balding pate and a permanent squint, received us in a cluttered study that smelled of paper, dust, and faintly of oranges. He gestured us in, wringing his hands. Holmes, thank heaven. I feared you might be abroad again. Holmes inclined his head. You mentioned an agent brought you a document. Laurie moved to a lacquered case and withdrew a sealed envelope, thick with age. Arrived by hand. No return address. The courier left immediately. Well-dressed, accent unplaceable. Inside, this. He drew out a folded parchment, yellowed but supple. The seal had been broken, but the remains were clearly visible. A design strikingly similar to the one we had seen in Ashton Leigh, though subtly altered. The inner arms of the cross were curled now, like coiled serpents, and the inscription below it had been rendered in a grotesque variant of Latin. Holmes lifted it delicately and examined it under the lamp. "This is not merely a forgery," he said. "It is a variation. The mark has evolved, suggesting hierarchy or authorship. Whoever issued this intended it to be distinct." Laurie leaned forward eagerly. "But the document itself. Look, Holmes. The ink, the penmanship, the folds. It's unlike any replica I've seen. The language suggests an account of Henry of Easthall's penance. Something no copy has ever survived. If real, it is not real," Holmes said flatly. "But it is calculated to appear so. Tell me, Professor, what did the agent say when he delivered it?" "Only that I had been selected to verify its significance, that others would soon be in contact." Holmes's brow darkened. "They're drawing a circle, Watson, pulling certain minds into the perimeter. First Northcote, now Laurie. To what end? Not simply to test the forgeries, but to build legitimacy through names." He turned back to Laurie. "Was this shown to anyone else?" "Number only you." Holmes exhaled, satisfied. "Then it can still be contained. But not if we stay idle." That evening, at Holmes's suggestion, we took rooms at the Bull Hotel. He remained quiet over supper, his expression like slate, until at last, as we returned to our room, he said, "They're preparing something larger." This was no attempt to sell a relic. This was a probe, a signal. They wanted to see how you'd react, and when. I, or someone like you. Trusted, scholarly, discreet. They will move again, and they will attempt to pass something else, something dangerous. He seated himself at the writing desk and drew out a clean sheet. "We must get ahead of them, Watson. We must anticipate their next offer. That means locating the source. Not the courier, not Petrelchus, but the architect. And how do we do that?" Holmes gave me a faint smile. "We bait the scholar's trap." He dipped his pen and wrote a single sentence, slowly and deliberately, "To whom it may concern. The seal is known. The code is broken. Shall we speak in terms of trade?" He folded the note and sealed it with wax. "This will be copied and passed, discreetly, through a chain of intermediaries. Bookshops, private collectors, a few willing antiquarians. They will know it's from me. And if they are who I suspect, they will respond." He sat back. "Now we wait." The following day passed in measured silence. Holmes did not stir from the room except for brief walks around the quadrangle. I remained close, rereading the Ashton Leigh notes and poring over maps of historical ecclesiastical centres, Lincoln, York, Canterbury, wondering if the next seed had already been planted in one of them. It was nearing dusk when the hotel porter brought an envelope, unmarked, to our room. Holmes accepted it without comment, opened it, and read the single line within. "Saturday, 11 p.m. The cloisters at Ely. Bring no one who asks questions." He folded the paper and looked at me. "Well, Watson," he said softly, "we've made contact." I frowned. Ely is a long journey. Holmes's eyes glittered. "Not if the truth lies beneath it." He stood and reached for his coat. "They mean to meet under cover of a place they think sacred. They've forgotten the sacred cannot be forged. We would go to Ely. We would step into the shadows of ancient stone where monks once walked and secrets now moved. And there, beneath the cloisters, Holmes meant to face the next link in the chain. And I, once again, would follow. The wind that swept across the marshes of Cambridgeshire was sharp and damp, curling under our collars as we stepped from the late evening train at Ely. The cathedral loomed beyond the station like a relic too large to be forgotten, its lantern tower bathed in silver moonlight, its spires spearing the night with quiet defiance. Even in the stillness, the vast structure exuded a presence that was more than architectural. It seemed to breathe. Holmes said nothing during the carriage ride into the town. His eyes never left the cathedral. His right hand, gloved and steady, rested over the lapel of his coat where the sealed message now lay. I watched him closely, noting the way his features held none of the usual theatrical detachment. He was coiled, focused, yet unusually solemn, as though even his mind, restless and swift as it was, acknowledged the danger of what lay ahead. We arrived at the south transept shortly before 11. The great nave was closed to the public, but a side door had been left unlatched, whether by invitation or oversight, I did not ask. Holmes led the way through the cloisters without hesitation. They were ancient, worn smooth by centuries of tread and prayer. Moonlight spilled through the high arches, pooling on the stone like shallow water. We reached the eastern cloister walk and paused. There, beneath a broken arch where ivy clung to the mortar, stood a figure, cloaked, motionless, and alone. Holmes raised a hand but said nothing. We approached slowly, our footsteps echoing like dropped pins. The figure turned as we came within a dozen paces. A woman, tall, dressed in a long grey traveling coat and gloves, her face obscured by the hood that cast shadow over her features. "You came," she said, her voice calm but firm. "He said you would." Holmes inclined his head. "And who is he?" "A man who does not enjoy attention, but he watches, and he listens, and he knows when someone is watching back." Holmes took a step closer. "You're the one who sent the letter to Baker Street." She said nothing. Holmes's tone did not shift. "And the message to Cambridge. You were the courier." A pause. Then softly, "I am the hand, but not the eye. Then speak with your own." The woman reached into her coat and withdrew a sealed envelope. She extended it to Holmes without approaching further. "You were meant to find Ashton Leigh," she said. "That was deliberate. Petralchus was compromised. He grew careless. He deviated from instruction and attempted profit. He failed. You did not." Holmes took the envelope, turning it once in his fingers. "What does your employer want?" "To offer you something." "What?" She hesitated. Then, "The truth, but only in pieces." I stepped forward. "Why? Why this theater? Why not name yourselves?" Her eyes, when they lifted beneath the hood, were intelligent but guarded. "Because what we offer is not understood when given in full. It must be absorbed slowly, like medicine or poison." Holmes opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, handwritten in the same precise script as the earlier note. "The next forgery is already in place. York, Cathedral Archives, Room of St. Olaf. Look beneath the altar stone. There lies the second clue. You have 3 days before the record is amended permanently. Use them." Holmes looked up. "Why send this to me?" "Because you can be trusted to see what others miss, but more than that, you can be trusted to act without falling in love with what you uncover. The truth, Mr. Holmes, is often a terrible burden. You speak like a convert." She allowed herself a small, bitter smile. "Number A, former librarian." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "Then you know what they're rewriting." "I know what they think they're rewriting. The past, but they're wrong. They're building a new belief, and when enough people believe, the forgery becomes fact." Holmes folded the page and slipped it into his coat. "Will I see you again?" "No," she said. "You're getting too close." And without waiting for response, she turned and disappeared into the opposite cloister, her footfalls fading into the night like the last notes of a hymn. We did not pursue her. Holmes stood very still for a long moment. Then he turned to me. 3 days. York is half a day's journey. I said. Sure, then we leave at first light. We returned to our lodgings in silence. Holmes did not sleep, nor did he rest. I heard him pacing in the next room until dawn, the soft rhythm of his steps like a ticking clock winding down toward something inevitable. The following day, we boarded the early train to York. The city greeted us with a grim drizzle, but Holmes seemed impervious to discomfort. He led us directly to the cathedral without pause for food or rest. There, at the administrative wing beside the chapter house, we requested access to the archives under the pretext of scholarly consultation. It was late afternoon when we were granted entry to the room of St. Olaf, an austere chamber lined with cabinets and stacks of iron-bound ledgers. At its center stood a low altar of sandstone, unremarkable but clean, its surface marked only by an iron cross set into the stone. Holmes walked slowly around it. Then he knelt and pressed his hands along the base. "There," he said quietly. "A seam." Together, we shifted the stone panel, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thin sheaf of papers. Holmes extracted them and laid them on the nearest desk. He flipped through the pages rapidly, his expression sharpening with each turn. Then he stopped and held one up to the light. It was a registry, a list of ordinations and appointments dating back to 1451. But across the top margin, an addition had been made. Faint, recent, but in the same careful hand we had now seen more than once. Robertus de Morum, Primus Archivarius, custodian of the true canon. Beneath it, a mark, not Petrarchus's sigil. A new one, a serpent devouring its own tail. Holmes stared at it. "They're leaving a trail," I murmured. "Breadcrumbs." "No," he said slowly. "They're leaving signposts for others to follow. This is a recruitment." "Into what?" Holmes looked up at me. "Into a conspiracy to reshape history, not through violence or war, but through ink, through misremembering. They aren't just forging relics, Watson. They're forging belief." He folded the sheet and placed it back in the cloth. "Seal it. We bring this back to London, but we tell no one else. Not yet." As we replaced the stone, Holmes paused with one hand on the altar. "When the past can be altered with such elegance," he said, "what becomes of truth?" I had no answer. And outside, the bells of York Minster rang the hour, not as heralds, but as warnings. By the time we returned to London, the air had thickened with summer haze, and Baker Street's familiar fog had been replaced by an oppressive stillness. Holmes sat beside me in the cab, silent and unmoving, the oilcloth bundle from York tucked securely beneath his arm. Though the street bustled with carriages and footsteps, Holmes did not so much as glance out the window. His gaze was fixed inward, upon a plane of thought I could only guess at. When we arrived, he went straight to his desk without removing his coat. He unwrapped the documents and spread them out with delicate precision, weighing down each corner with a familiar object: the brass magnifier, the Moroccan paperweight, the old clay pipe. Then he opened his notebook and, for the next several hours, worked with such singularity of focus that I found myself unable to speak for fear of breaking the spell. It was just past midnight when he finally pushed back from the desk, the tip of his pen frozen mid-word. "They've named themselves," he said. I looked up from the chair by the hearth. "Who?" Holmes tapped the margin of the document we had recovered beneath the altar in York. "This entry, Robertus de Moreham, custodian of the true canon." The phrasing is deliberate, not merely a false appointment, but a signal. De Moreham never existed, but the title, that is their invention. And this, he pointed to the looping sigil of the serpent devouring its tail, is not just symbolic. It is organizational, the mark of the Ordo Ouroboros. "The Order of the Serpent," I said. "Ouroboros," he repeated, "an emblem as ancient as belief itself, used by mystics, alchemists, theologians, always in reference to cycles of truth and distortion. It is the perfect metaphor for their aim." which is to recreate the past in their image, to fabricate histories not only for wealth or prestige, but to guide future conviction. They believe that by altering sacred documents, they can redirect the very axis of cultural memory. And York was only the second. Holmes nodded. The second we've uncovered, but I suspect there are more, and the next may not wait for us to arrive. He rose and stepped to the window. The city stretched before him in silhouette, its rooftops indistinct beneath the weak starlight. They wanted me to see this, he said softly. Every breadcrumb, every whisper was a lure. Not to dissuade me, but to invite me. Invite you, yes, to participate, or to bear witness, or perhaps even to join. He turned back, and his expression was colder than I had seen in weeks. But that is not their miscalculation. Their miscalculation is in believing that I cannot read their endgame. He strode to the cabinet and drew out a slim folio of correspondence, flipping through it until he extracted a letter marked in deep green ink. He held it out to me. This, he said, was sent to a private collector in Amsterdam just 6 weeks ago. The contents, a supposed fragment from the Council of Nicaea, allegedly recovered from a Syrian monastery, destroyed during the Napoleonic campaigns. The ink, the language, the seals, eerily familiar. The same hand. Holmes nodded. Or one trained by the same. And the most troubling part? It came with a letter of authentication signed by an anonymous party bearing only the sigil of the Ouroboros. The collector, skeptical, had it tested by a document expert. The parchment was 600 years old. The ink, however, was less than 5. They're aging documents artificially. Yes, but that's not new. What is new is the coordination, the timing. These aren't random frauds. They're placed with intent, into academic circles, private archives, even ecclesiastical vaults. Slowly, imperceptibly, they are overwriting the script of history. He dropped into the chair and steepled his fingers. And I have reason to believe the next forgery will not be a document. I stared at him. What do you mean? I mean they are moving to relics, physical artifacts, bones, vestments, altar stones, things that evoke visceral faith, things that, once declared genuine, are harder to disprove. I felt a chill. Do you know where? Perhaps. He reached into the folio and withdrew a second page. A letter intercepted by one of my contacts in Rome. A shipment scheduled to arrive at the Basilica of St. Benedict in Fulda, Germany. The manifest lists only one item, Arca Martrum, the chest of the martyrs. Holmes nodded. A relic long thought lost in the Wars of Succession, but it is more than a reliquary. According to early accounts, it was said to contain the femur of St. Tiberius, an obscure figure canonized by oral tradition alone. If it were to be rediscovered and authenticated, it could become the keystone of an entire theological narrative. I understood at once. And if that narrative is false, if it's built on forgery, then every doctrine it supports would be tainted. Precisely. Holmes stood. We leave tomorrow for Fulda. We must intercept the artifact before it is consecrated. Once it is installed in a cathedral, the truth becomes not a question of ink or bone, but of belief. And belief, Watson, is the one thing they are counting on to outlast scrutiny. That night, I slept little. I lay awake listening to Holmes move about in the adjoining room, the rustle of papers punctuated by the occasional strike of his pen. By morning, he was ready. Composed, deliberate, already charting our route as we left for the station. As the train rumbled eastward through France and into Germany, Holmes briefed me further. His contact in Fulda was a monk named Brother Anselm, who had grown suspicious of the sudden influx of donations tied to a planned exhibit of early Christian relics. A week earlier, he had reached out through an encoded channel Holmes had established during a prior investigation involving forged Templar seals. The timing of Anselm's warning aligned too precisely with the intercepted letter to be ignored. We arrived in Fulda 2 days later, under the pale shadow of a gathering storm. The town was quiet, cobblestoned, draped in the slow dignity of antiquity. The basilica rose above it, red sandstone and domes silhouetted against the clouded sky. Brother Anselm received us at a side entrance, his robes damp with rain, his eyes sunken with worry. He led us through narrow halls into a private archive beneath the sacristy. "There," he said, pointing to a large wooden crate sealed with wax. "It arrived yesterday morning. The abbot believes it's a sign, a miracle." Holmes moved to the crate and examined the seal, not official, but carefully styled to imitate one. "Has anyone opened it?" "No," Anselm said. "They're waiting for the bishop." Holmes knelt, removed a small blade from his coat, and broke the wax. He lifted the lid. Inside lay a linen-wrapped bundle nestled in straw. Holmes unwrapped it slowly, layer by layer, until the object within emerged, a wooden chest, dark and polished, the kind used to house sacred relics. He opened it. Within, resting on a pillow of red velvet, was a single human bone, a femur. Beside it, a folded vellum document. Holmes lifted it, read it, and handed it to me. The writing was ornate. Latin, but the seal at the bottom. Once again, the Ouroboros. Holmes exhaled. "They've begun. This is the first of many. What now?" "We stop the consecration. We expose the fraud, and then we follow the trail." He stood, face unreadable. "They believe the past can be rewritten without resistance. Let us prove them wrong." Outside, thunder cracked against the sky. The storm had arrived. The storm broke over Fulda with a violence that rattled the cathedral's stained-glass windows and sent rain sheeting across the cloisters in grey, slanted waves. Thunder echoed through the vaulted stone halls like the voice of a distant tribunal, stern and watchful. Beneath it all, within the cloistered quiet of the archive room, Holmes stood motionless before the opened reliquary, his expression unreadable, save for the tautness around his jaw. Brother Anselm crossed himself silently, his eyes fixed on the bone nestled in velvet. "They intend to present it during Sunday Mass," he said, voice hushed despite the thunder. "A public unveiling. The bishop has already composed a homily." Holmes reached down and picked up the accompanying vellum once more. "This document is the linchpin," he murmured. "Without it, the artifact is merely a curiosity. With it, they assign it lineage, authority, divinity." I stepped closer. "Can it be disproved?" Holmes's mouth twisted faintly. "It is clever, astoundingly so. The ink is old, though not nearly as old as the text claims. The phrasing mimics ecclesiastical Latin from the 9th century, but slips, subtle ones, reveal its modern origin. A construction of scholarship, not living use. Whoever wrote this knew just enough to fool the devoted and just little enough to alarm the discerning. He closed the reliquary lid slowly, as if sealing away more than just bone. They are escalating. First manuscripts, then burial records, now sacred objects, each forgery more audacious than the last. Brother Anselm looked between us. "Will you confront the bishop?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. Not until we know who delivered it and how far the rot has spread." We returned with Anselm through a narrow passage to a disused vestry, where he produced the delivery manifest. Holmes studied it briefly and let out a sharp breath. "Here, the crate was logged under a name I've seen before. Marienfeld Antiquities, Antwerp." "That's Petralcas's old channel," I said, recognizing it at once. Holmes nodded grimly. "But the courier's signature is new. A. Brangwyn. Not a known associate, likely a placeholder, a pseudonym to obscure the true hand." Anselm hesitated, then stepped to a cabinet and withdrew a narrow case of black leather. "This was left with the bishop's copy of the document," he said. "He believed it was a gift from the same donor." Holmes opened the case. Inside was a ring, heavy, dark, and unmistakable. Another Ouroboros, but this one bore a slight variance from the others. The serpent's eye had been set with a minuscule red garnet. Holmes's voice was flat. A marker, likely denoting rank. He turned to me. Watson, if they are distributing these with the artifacts, they are branding not merely objects, but participants. We must assume the bishop is either a pawn or a player. Do we question him? Holmes considered, then shook his head. Not directly. We need confirmation, something indisputable. For that, we go to the origin. The crate came from Antwerp. The forwarding office is listed here, Rue des Minimes. We travel tonight. I blinked. But the storm is precisely why we'll go unnoticed. With Anselm's reluctant blessing, we left Fulda after nightfall, bundled against the weather and carrying with us only what could be concealed. Holmes carried the vellum and ring in a sealed envelope tucked inside his coat. I took the delivery log. It was early morning by the time we reached Antwerp. The city, slick with rain, shone under lamplight like a shell. Holmes wasted no time. We went directly to Rue des Minimes and found the forwarding office in a quiet quarter near the old merchant wharves. A low building of soot-darkened stone with a rusted bell and a door that opened only after Holmes produced an aged business card bearing the crest of a London antiquarian house, one long since shuttered but respected still by reputation. The clerk was old, taciturn, but Holmes had a gift for languages and bribery, both. In short order, he learned what he needed. The crate bound for Fulda had not come through customs but had arrived in a private shipment marked devotional statuary. Its point of origin, a warehouse on the edge of the city's dock district, one leased to a firm named Kellam Maritime Holdings. Holmes's eyes sharpened at once. "I know that name," he said. "It was listed as a shell corporation in a land dispute over a Benedictine site in Sardinia, where forged maps were found suggesting that the Vatican had once claimed the land. But the maps disappeared before trial, the same pattern." We made our way to the docks in a hired cab, arriving as morning broke in dull, bruised clouds over the North Sea. The warehouse was vast and anonymous, its only distinguishing feature a black painted door and a faded coat of arms above it, something once noble, now peeled and illegible. Holmes picked the lock with clinical efficiency. We slipped inside. The interior was cavernous, stacked high with crates of every size. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by our breath and footfalls, but it wasn't until we reached the far wall that we saw the truth of it. Rows of relics, some wrapped in cloth, others resting in half-open cases, chalices, rosaries, bones, parchments, each carefully tagged in Latin, each bearing the mark of the Ouroboros. Holmes stood motionless before them. "This," he said softly, "is not forgery. It's manufacturing, a factory of belief." He stepped forward, examining the tags. "Here, one bound for Prague, another for Lyon. And this, look, Watson, London, St. Etheldreda's." I felt something tighten in my chest. "They've already infiltrated Britain," he nodded. "They are seeding the continent, quietly, purposefully. And if we don't stop them, soon, their fictions will become fact, their relics revered." We turned at the sound of a distant door opening. Voices. At least two, moving toward the main floor. Holmes gestured silently, and we slipped behind a stack of shipping pallets, crouching low. Two men entered. One tall and lean, the other broad and cloaked. They spoke in German, but Holmes translated under his breath. "They are discussing the next shipment. One departs for Rome in 3 days. It contains a relic of St. Adrian the Veiled, a name that doesn't exist. The tall one says the order was expedited. The cloaked one agrees, but says the London complication has delayed funding. They'll contact V to intervene." I whispered, V for... Holmes's eyes gleamed. Possibly Vernon Laurie, or someone above him. We waited until the men had passed, then slipped out the side entrance into the rain. Holmes did not speak until we were halfway back to the hotel. They are well-funded, well-placed, but not omniscient. They miscalculated Fulda, and now we have a lead. What do we do with it? We alert the Vatican, discreetly. We bring in the Archbishop of Canterbury's office. We begin to dismantle the chain, not with arrests, but with exposure. He turned to me as we entered the lobby. But more importantly, we catalogue everything, every artifact, every falsehood, because one day, Watson, someone will try to tell this story differently, and when they do, they'll find a record that cannot be erased. That evening, Holmes began the work of transcription. I joined him, and together we wrote, not merely as detectives, but as historians at war with silence. Because truth, once buried, must be exhumed. Carefully, and with honor. It was some weeks later, as September's first chill swept the summer haze from London streets, that Holmes and I sat once more in our Baker Street lodgings, the fire lit and a stack of final correspondence resting on the table between us. Outside, the leaves of the plane trees rustled crisply in the evening air, and Mrs. Hudson's radio could be faintly heard below, offering a lullaby of string and brass. But Holmes was not at rest. Though the immediate threat had passed and the Fulda operation had been dismantled, his mind remained caught in the residue of the case. Across the room, he held a letter from Rome, its contents brief but unmistakable. The Vatican's Secretariat had verified the discovery of the Antwerp warehouse, and the catalogued relics had been seized and transported under ecclesiastical guard. Several bishops, including one of dubious appointment from Venice, had resigned quietly. Vernon Laurie, the Cambridge professor who had received the forged manuscript, had vanished from public view, his lectures cancelled, his rooms emptied, and a single page left in his study with the words, "The canon bends toward creation." Holmes laid the letter aside. "They've gone to ground, Watson. Not defeated, merely scattered, like ash in the wind. But they've been seen now, named, and that, in their world, is anathema. You believe they'll try again?" "In time," he said. "But not soon. Their strength was in silence, in working beneath the skin of history. That skin is torn now. Their secrecy has become spectacle." I nodded slowly. "The Church has issued a moratorium on new relic certifications. The British Museum's Council has opened an internal review on ecclesiastical artifacts acquired since 1890. Even Trinity College has begun re-examining provenance statements. You've done more than stop them. You've made others curious. That," Holmes murmured, "is the only antidote to forgery. Curiosity. Not outrage, not belief, but the desire to look again." He turned then to the desk and opened his notebook, thin now, its pages nearly filled. The final entry, written in his precise mechanical hand, was simple. The Order of the Ouroboros intended to rewrite the past by placing new truths where old ones lay buried. But what they failed to anticipate was that memory, like ink, leaves traces. You cannot overwrite the past without first contending with its ghost. He closed the book. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with the evening post and a tray of tea. Among the envelopes was one addressed not to Holmes, but to me. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a drawing made in delicate charcoal, of an Ouroboros, this time broken in two. Beneath it, a line in Latin, "Veritas est fractura nostra." Truth is our fracture. Holmes glanced at it briefly and smiled. "They've heard us, Watson, and they're rattled. But not finished." "No," he said, "not finished. But neither are we." We drank our tea in silence. And as the fire crackled in the hearth and London settled into its twilight murmur, I thought of the dusty shoes, the forged histories, the cloisters of Ely, and the reliquary in Fulda. I thought of the patient hands that had written lies so beautiful they almost passed for faith. And I thought of Holmes, unyielding, unblinking, dragging truth into the light, not with sermon or sword, but with ink, logic, and persistence. The world would forget. It always did. But Sherlock Holmes never did. And as long as he remembered, the forgers of history would never rest easy.